Today's artist is Georges Seurat. He introduces pointillism in the art world through color theory, actually. We talked a little bit about color theory and the fascinating science of how dyes and paints were actually discovered at the last art talk, I guess now 3 weeks ago. You might actually remember the discovery of Prussian blue, which is a really incredibly deep blue. When ferrocyanide salts were actually accidentally mixed with red cochineal dye and potash. And just in case you forgot, I want to remind everybody, here is the formula for Prussian blue, in case you want to try to make some of your own. So in the 19th century, based on Newton's theories on light, French chemist Marcel Chevreul recognized that colors actually consisted of primary colors, and every school child knows that those are essentially red, yellow, and blue. And Jacques is going to demonstrate this to us on this painter's easel there. Oh, fantastic, Jacques. And intermediary colors, which are orange, green, and purple. And you can see that those are actually created by mixing the colors. And Jacques is actually going to create for us the color wheel. Fantastic. And the color wheel is still used by artists today after all these centuries. Let's take a look at this.
Yeah, pretty cool, right? I mean, it's
oh, fantastic. Look at that.
It's impressive how yellow and red make orange, how blue green, and yellow make green.
Purple. Yeah,
and you get purple.
Hey, can you sign that for us, please, Jacques? Because I think we can auction that off at the end of today's town hall.
Oh, let the bidding begin.
Okay. So the color wheel is still used by artists today. And any two colors side by side, so you might be able to see here, will produce a different color seen by the human eye. You can actually see a halo. After you stare at one of the primary colors, that halo is the opposite color. So for example, red will produce a slight green halo, and yellow will produce a slight purple halo. So all of these ideas are actually very important in our featured artist, Georges Seurat. And it's the technique that he uses called pointillism. And pointillism is using dots of paint, right? Which is, what Jacques said, it's just really just literally dots of paint to create new colors that the human eye perceives in depth that are actually much more interesting than simply mixing paints and using a brush. All right, so now it's time for Sarah and Art Talk number 45, Georges Seurat. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jacques and AJ, for that great introduction. Let me share my screen.
Will you keep bidding on Jacques' piece of art?
Yes, definitely. That was a great demonstration of the color wheel and kind of this idea of color theory that was a really popular topic at this point in time in art and art history. So let's start this slideshow. Great. So Georges Seurat was born in Paris on December 2nd, 1859. He was the youngest of 3 children. His father, Chrysostome Antoine Seurat, was a bailiff, and his mother, Ernestine Fèvre, came from a wealthy family of sculptors. So Seurat's father had already retired with kind of a small fortune by the time Seurat was born, but his father spent most of his time in Le Raincy, which was a commune outside of Paris, so the young Seurat lived with his mother and his 2 other siblings. Georges Seurat was first studied art at the École Municipale de Sculpture and Dessin near his family's home in the Boulevard Magenta, which was run by the sculptor Justin Lequien. In 1878, he moved on to the École des Beaux-Arts, the famous art school in Paris that I've talked about with different previous artists, where he was taught by Henry Lehmann and followed a pretty conventional academic art training, kind of drawing casts of antique sculptures and copying drawings by the old masters. Seurat only lived until he was 31, but throughout his brief career, he really manifested an unusually strong interest in the intellectual and scientific bases of art that AJ and Jacques mentioned. So at the beginning of Seurat's career, he made about 70 oil studies on small wood panels, which he called croquetons, or little sketches. And these durable boards were easily transported and held in the hand, making them ideal for painting outdoors. So this is among the earliest of the studies that Seurat made along the Seine River on the outskirts of Paris, where fishermen cast their lines into the water. This is more classic Impressionism with the blended strokes of color rather than Neo-Impressionism, which Seurat was most known for. Seurat spent 1883 working on his first major painting, this large canvas titled Bathers at Asnières. And it was a monumental work showing some young men relaxing by the Seine in kind of a working class suburb of Paris. And this painting actually depicts the same stretch of riverbank from the fisherman painting I just showed, but you can see how different in style they are. So the Bathers is his initial attempt at reconciling kind of classicism with modern quasi-scientific approaches to color and form. And although influenced in its use of color and light tone by Impressionism, the painting with its kind of smooth, simplified textures and carefully outlined sculptural figures shows the impact of his neoclassical training. So we're moving more into this neo-impressionism, neoclassical kind of period. And here we can see some of Seurat's preliminary sketches of the different figures that are included in the final painting. And these are important, almost artifacts that showcase the method and the process that Seurat used when creating these larger pointillism works. It had to be sketched and thought out before meticulously bringing to life the scene he intended to portray. And I think for this sketch, it's interesting to note that these were done in something called conté crayon, which is a medium made of natural pigments, clay, and graphite. They're much waxier and firmer than typical soft pastels. So it's almost like a mix between a pencil, chalk, and a pastel. So you might recognize this painting. Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte was one of the standout works in the 8th and the last Impressionist exhibition in 1884. And after that, it was shown that year at the Société des Artistes Indépendants. And it encouraged an art critic named Félix Fénéon to invent the name Neo-Impressionism. So this painting took Seurat 2 years to complete, and he spent much of his time sketching in the park in preparation. And it really was to become the most famous picture of the 1880s, and still to this day is an international icon of French Neo-Impressionism. So the site, again, situated on the Seine River in the northwest of Paris, is also close by to his other works. And Seurat's technique was similar, employing these tiny juxtaposed dots of multicolored paint that allowed the viewer's eye to blend the colors optically rather than having the colors blended on the canvas or pre-blended as material pigment. Here again, in Conté Crayon, we can see one of Seurat's sketches in preparation for the larger piece. Seurat painted this piece the same year that the Eiffel Tower was built by Gustave Eiffel as the grand entrance to the 1889 World's Fair. And this painting is on a wood panel and is actually rather small. It's just 6 by 9.5 inches. But again, we can see Seurat's pointillism style, but on a much smaller scale. So we've returned back to Seurat's favorite place to paint, on the banks of the Seine. And here we have Grey Weather, La Grande Jatte, and The Seine and La Grande Jatte, both done in 1889, but at different times of the year. And it's great to see these two side by side because we can see what a few slight changes in the color does to the overall tone of these pointillism works. Young Woman Powdering Herself is a portrait of Seurat's mistress, Madeleine Knobloch. Knobloch was a working class woman with whom Seurat maintained a long-term secret relationship, keeping her separate not only from his bourgeois family, but also from his bohemian friends. So when this painting was shown in 1890, her identity as his mistress remained concealed. And ultimately, she was given some of Seurat's paintings as an inheritance, but she cut off all communication with his family after his death. Something really interesting about this particular piece, as you can see, is that an X-ray reveals that Seurat originally painted a face, said by some to be a self-portrait, in the frame on the wall, but was persuaded by a friend to paint it out and replace it with a vase of flowers. Maybe it was a way for him to reveal their secret affair, and then, his friend persuaded him not to. So the can-can was first exhibited at the 1890 at the Salon de la Société des Artistes Indépendants in Paris. And the can-can became a target of art critics and was widely discussed among symbolist critics in particular. So the symbolist movement has its roots in poetry, but also other arts as well. And it was seeking to represent these kind of absolute truths symbolically through metaphorical images and language. It was mainly a reaction against naturalism and realism. And Seurat's early paintings, for example, the bathers and the fishermen and the people in the park, they often feature kind of a remarkable stillness, even with these complex figure compositions. But the circus and both the can-can as well feature scenes of dynamic movement and is more typical of his late style. So the scene in the circus is actually borrowed from an anonymous poster for the Nouveau Cirque that was printed in 1888. And there's a figure in the first row of seats with a silk hat and a lock of hair visible under it. And it is said to be a friend of Seurat's, the painter Charles Engrand. And this painting was Seurat's last and was left unfinished when he died suddenly in March of 1891. And it was sold shortly thereafter to his friend Paul Signac. So Seurat had a short life, but left behind this enormous legacy. He took a really scientific approach to painting by exploring color theory. And he believed that a painter could use color to create harmony and emotion in kind of the same way that a musician uses counterpoint and variation to create harmony in music. And so we'll end with this quote of his: "They see poetry in what I have done. No, I apply my method, and that is all there is to it." Thank you, everyone.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you for that.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very fascinating. So we have time for a few questions. I have. Let me start with the first question. So, and later in life, as he did the circus and the can-can, did he still continue to use pointillism as his basic technique?
Yes. So I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but both the can-can and the cirque are in the style of pointillism. So that's something that he kind of carried throughout his career and really he was known for.
Did he ever do anything after a certain point that was not pointillism?
I am not familiar with anything in particular. He definitely did things at the beginning of his career when he was training. As I meant, the fisherman on the banks of the Seine, that was more kind of classic impressionist. I would have to look more into that to see if he did anything other than pointillism later in his career.
All right, cool. Well, do we have any questions from the audience?
I'll make an observation. It's kind of interesting that Le Grand Jatte, it's a big painting. It's been like 7 feet wide by 10 feet, or yeah, it's 10 feet wide by 7 feet tall. And I think I saw an estimate that there's 500,000 strokes, dots
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
on that. That's 2 years. 2 years.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. And yeah, I mean, it must have been, kind of frustrating to do tiny little dots. And you're probably, when he was working on it, it's such a huge piece. He was probably, looking at it so up close. And then you really have to be able to step back to kind of look at the whole image.
Fantastic. All right.
I wonder how many corrections there are in that.
Point out. Fantastic. Hey, thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to have you back.
Thank you all.